as the United States industrializes, this brings some social issues into view, and it leads to the growth of the labor movement. The labor force expanded rapidly in the late 1800s, and it actually increases about 29% in the 1870s. There's this shift from independent skilled craftspeople to machine-driven jobs requiring little skill. So workers had little chance of improving their lives because they weren't taught a trade or anything like that. And we've learned about a lot of this when we talked about earlier industrialization in the United States. And that continued shift from rural to urban continues to occur in the late 1800s. The benefits to the industrialization is that it creates a surplus of goods. Okay, people can actually buy things now. And it leads to deflation, which decreases the prices in goods and services. Again, allowing common everyday people to purchase items. So their buying power increases. They work fewer hours, and women's participation within the workforce also expands. Okay, remember that we saw women working back in the 1840s and 50s in the mills, right? The textile mills. We also saw women taking on a role working in factories during the Civil War, but much like what happens when we think of Rosie the Riveter in World War II, after the war, women go back to the home and the men go back to work. So this is again another opportunity for women to start working in the workforce. However, the negatives are that women are paid less, and there are fewer opportunities that are open to them. Working at this time is very dangerous, especially if you're working in an industry like railroads, coal mining, steel, meat packing. Okay, there was constant danger and even death. And in 1906, Upton Sinclair, who also gains the name of a muckraker because he's calling out these unfair practices, writes the book that you see on the right side of your page here, The Jungle. And it brought the poor living conditions and dangers of the meatpacking industry in Chicago into the forefront of the public. And we will read some excerpts and things from it, but it really is quite detailed, and it seems like it's something that could not happen, or it's fictionalized, but it's not. It's based on true stories. In 1907, 5,242 miners died. 12% of steel plant workers in Chicago died or suffered injuries while working in the steel industry. Managers blamed the workers, but soon they realized that a lot of the hazards that were in these businesses caused these injuries. At this time, we start to see some of these more social programs come out of this. Things like workers' compensation, which is workers who have been injured could receive assistance for medical care and loss of income if it was not due to their own negligence. In 1911, Wisconsin's the first state to pass the first laws that are like that, but by 1920, 43 states had some kind of workers' compensation packages. Child labor peaks at this time. Kids are easier to control, they can pay them a lot less, and families needed kids to work to help support those families. So while they're working, they can't attend school. In 1880, 182,000 kids younger than 16 were working in factories throughout the country. They'd work long hours and in very dangerous conditions. You hear stories about kids getting put into machinery because they're small to fit in there, going into clean parts and oil parts and things like that. I mean, a very dangerous environment for anyone, let alone small children. But at this time, there's this increased belief in laissez-faire economics. And laissez-faire economics is a hands-off approach to a free market economy. Essentially, businesses were in control of their businesses with little or no oversight, especially by the government. Free market is this idea that you can buy and trade with whoever you want. The government rarely became involved with these businesses. And for justification, they use that idea of social Darwinism that we had talked about with the robber barons. The idea that, the rich are rich because of natural selection. And so they claim that social reform actually imposed a financial burden on the middleman, which is a lie. Okay, and it actually was more of a financial burden for the wealthy who would take that money away from the middle class to be able to maintain the life they've created. Workers began to stand up for their rights and protections at this time. So labor unions are developed, which are groups of workers who band together to achieve better pay, safer working conditions, and other benefits. They have strikes, and a strike is a work stoppage. Unionized workers in highly trained positions knew they had the upper hand. These businesses needed them, and so they used that to their advantage. In July 1877, you had the Great Railroad Strike, which happens in Martinsburg, West Virginia. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which is B&O Railroad, cut the pay to their workers by 10%, but maintained and extended their hours of work. They got mad about this, and they go on strike. So the strike actually ends up spreading to larger cities, Baltimore, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and in the end, about 100,000 workers take place in this. However, riots break out and federal troops get sent in. About 100 people die during this Great Railroad Strike. At the same time, the Knights of Labor are created, which is one of the first major unions in the country. It's not localized, it's a national union. And it was founded in 1869. Some of the biggest things they were fighting for was the 8-hour workday, social reforms, and equality. They offered membership to women and African Americans, which was basically unheard of at this time and set them apart from other unions. In May of 1886, the McCormick Works in Chicago has a riot, and it's called the Haymarket Riot. Remember, McCormick's the one who's creating the reaper that helps with harvesting wheat and things like that. So what had happened were scabs were trying to enter the factory. A scab is a person who isn't part of the union, and they're willing to cross the strike line to keep the factory going. Okay, so union members were harassing these scabs as they're trying to enter and as they're trying to leave the factories. This ends up turning violent. The Chicago police get called in. At some point, someone throws a bomb. The police open fire on the crowd. Several policemen and protesters are killed. The police, of course, blame the labor leaders for the bombing. To this day, no one knows who actually threw the bomb. And they claim that the labor movement supported terrorism and anarchism. And anarchism is this anti-government belief, this idea that you shouldn't have people controlling your life at all. Everybody should just look out for themselves. When we talk about this in government, a lot of times kids are like, oh, it's the purge, right? This idea that it's every man for themselves. In the end, 8 people are arrested and 7 are sentenced to death. They are all strikers. No one from the Chicago Police Department is ever held accountable for what happens that day. Another union is formed about the same time, and it's called the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And this union focuses strictly on economic gains rather than social reform, like what the Knights of Labor had done, bringing women and African Americans into the talks. They fought for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. As unions grew, the steel and railroad industries continued to face increasing number of strikes. The Homestead Steel Strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania focused on the Carnegie Steel Mills. Okay, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers Union had a contract that was set to expire on July 1st of 1892. Carnegie had left the country to go back to Scotland to visit his family and take a much-needed break, and he left a man by the name of Henry Clay Frick in charge. And Frick was ruthless, okay? He was kind of Carnegie's right-hand man. He really trusted him, but he was a ruthless operations manager at Carnegie Steel. He strongly opposed the union, and so he cuts wages, he locks the workers out of the mill, and he fires all of the union workers, which is about 3,800 people. Frick hires the Pinkerton Detective Agency to come in and break the strike. Okay, the guys go on strike. The Pinkertons are there. They end up firing on the crowd. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons are killed. And eventually, because of the violence, the National Guard is sent in to restore order by the federal government. In 1894, the Pullman Palace Car Company in Chicago has the Pullman strike. In 1881, the Pullman Palace Car Company established a company town near their factory in Illinois. The Pullman car actually has, unfortunately, the death of Abraham Lincoln to thank for their success. The car that Lincoln was taken back to Springfield in after his assassination was a Pullman car, and people around the country saw them. They were very luxurious, those kinds of things, and so they really gained a lot of national attention. So anyway, these factory towns had housing, shops, libraries, parks, other amenities that you need in a town. And by creating a company town, the company had greater control over their workers' personal lives and the workers themselves. They didn't allow free discussion, independent newspapers, or observance of religion other than Protestant. So if you were Catholic, too bad. You're not going to be able to recognize your religion, or at least not widely. You won't have a church in town, for instance. Or if you're Jewish, right, you don't get to recognize the Sabbath. And the other thing that this allows is the company to charge whatever they want. And so they actually ended up charging higher rent than what these people would have paid if they had lived in a different town. In 1893, when the economic recession hits, another one, Pullman cuts his wages and extends his hours. But he expected his residents to continue to pay the same amount of rent and expenses. And this really angers the workers, and they join the American Railway Union. The American Railway Union is led by this man, Eugene V. Debs. It's the first union to bring workers from an entire industry together. So railway workers, no matter where you lived in the country, could join. Excuse me. It turned this local Pullman strike into a national strike. When the unions tried to talk to Pullman, he fired them. And workers called for this strike. So railroad traffic in the Midwest grinds to a halt. President Grover Cleveland sends federal troops into Illinois to get trains moving again. Violence breaks out. Several strikers are killed. Debs, this guy here, tries to end the strike, but he's arrested. And during his imprisonment is when he becomes interested in socialism, which is a political theory that advocates that the community as a whole should control the production, distribution, and exchange of goods and services. And he forms the Socialist Party of America. And we'll actually read one of his writings when we talk about World War I.